So bonjour, welcome everyone. My name is Jean-Marc Mangin. I'm the President and CEO of Philanthropic Foundations Canada. I'm very pleased to welcome you, all of you, on our very first webinar of 2021. And before I introduce our guest today, let me make a land acknowledgement. And for those of you who speaks only French, I'll say a few words. Donc, le webinaire, c'est essentiellement en anglais, mais si vous avez besoin de traduction, il y a un bouton au bas de votre écran pour interprétation et vous choisissez l'option français. Et n'hésitez pas à poser vos questions en français à la fin de la session. Elles seront traduites également pour les bénéfices des panélistes. So let me start with the land acknowledgement. To begin, we'd like to recognize the many territories of Turtle Island, Canada, on which we work and reside. These territories are home to many Indigenous nations who have lived here for tens of thousands of years and continue to live here. As settlers, immigrants and their descendants, and as visitors, we honor and respect the many Indigenous peoples of this land and hope for a much just future together. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So that's our common future in 2021. We in this midst of a very dark winter, and how do we get out of this winter? What are the lights at the end of this tunnel? And how do we take advantage to make sure that these lights include all of us? So to do that, we have two amazing panelists to have this conversation today. Our first one is Joanna Kerr from the President CEO of MakeWay, which is a leading national charity that built partnerships and solutions to help nature and communities thrive together. Prior to MakeWay, Joanna led Greenpeace and also served as the first female chief executive of Action Aid International. And Joanna is also the chair of the Equality Fund, Canada's global fund for women, and has lived not only in Canada, but across Africa, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. So welcome, Joanna. And we also are joined by Zia Khan, who is the Senior Vice President for Innovation at the Rockefeller Foundation. And Zia oversees the foundation's approach to developing solutions that can have transformative impact on people's life with a focus on innovative finance, data, and technology and science. Zia has served on the World Economic Forum Advisory Council for Social Innovation and the US National Advisory Board for Impact Investing. He's also an investor and advisor to a range of impact-oriented enterprise. Zia, who grew up in Ottawa, holds a PhD from Stanford University. So Zia, also welcome. So
thank you.
Thanks for doing this. But I'd like to know how you're feeling to start 2021. Are you exhausted? Are you energized by the multiple crises facing us? When I talk to people, I see a lot of fatigue and exhaustion. So how do you keep going? Joanna, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, thanks, Jean-Marc, and thank you very much for inviting me. And it's great to get the new year off, just like this. I guess I'm rested. I'm feeling, watching the news, what's happening south of the border, a little bit hopeful that some of the craziness of the past 4 years might be beyond us, but I don't want to speak too soon on that. I guess I'm also daunted by how much COVID is growing. And, I think people are really fed up and they are, it shows that people are fed up, right? That they're not necessarily socially distancing and sticking to the rules. So I think it's going to be a really tough winter around the world. I think it's going to be really tough, but I am an optimist at heart. And I think just this overall year, full of multiple crises, has just started a kind of a profound awakening in so many places that we didn't necessarily suspect. And I think it's just creating a bunch of opportunities for us. And I'm really inspired by a bunch of new voices that are on the stage now that are trying to lead: Indigenous voices, Black voices, young voices, female voices. And I'm also really inspired by what kind of the power of movements has brought us in these past 9 months or so. So looking forward to seeing what will happen next.
And Zia, how are you feeling as we speak? There's an attempt to overturn the results of the US election.
Yeah. Well, living south of the border, today I feel optimistic. I'll pick up on Joanna's time horizons. I'm optimistic that a lot of the drama and kind of storytelling and posturing will finally be over, and it looks like we'll be able to get back to the business of government, and things will settle down. So I'm optimistic after today and this week that we'll see a lot more stability on that front. COVID, I agree. I think it is a worrisome situation for the next few months. I think it'll be tough. On the one hand, we know what to do in terms of wearing masks and staying, apart from each other, whether society can manage that or not. But there's a light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccines, which we're very fortunate are proving to be quite effective. And there's so much political attention on getting them distributed. I hope the vaccination efforts pick up. But to me, the real story of 2020 was what COVID revealed. And it shone a light on some environmental issues, social issues, racial issues. And now that we've shown a light on those, those problems are not going to go away. And there are responses and energy that we need to harness as well. On the one hand, that's a positive because we can harness and use that energy to get to a new normal state that will help us in the long term. But it'll be difficult, and there's hard work and hard conversations to be happening, because I really think we're evolving from one era to another. And that's where I think the panelists here and the people who are listening can play a critical role, which is how do we start to channel that energy and use some of these opportunities to achieve what might have been harder to achieve without a crisis like this, as we think in the long term.
So in terms of the role of and the contribution of philanthropy, I mean, you started touching on it, but what have we learned in 2020 that we didn't know before? That in terms of the unique contribution that philanthropy can make to the public good, in relationship with governments, in relationship with civil society, what strikes you as important learnings for the community? And feel free, Zia and Joanna, to get us going. And
Zia, why don't I let you go first on that one?
Thank you, Joanna. So I'll share a few thoughts. One is that I think philanthropy and at least what I've seen here in the United States is got a little bit more creative in terms of what they could do. And I think they abandoned their own constraints. So for example, just being able to pivot quickly and help supplement and provide immediate assistance to people in need, knowing that if that wasn't done, then people would have, bigger long-term issues. I think that was a lesson for a lot of philanthropies, the ability to pivot quickly and respond. But I also think there was another lesson for philanthropy where we learned about, still the ability and importance of focusing on the long term. And as everyone's attention and government's attention and civil society's attention was appropriately on the near-term crisis, setting the stage for the medium-term recovery and even the longer-term reset that we want to move towards was important. And I think that is a role that philanthropy has always played in terms of thinking about the long term. It's very difficult when there's a literal fire raging like COVID and other challenges. And so it's a strategic question on how much you need to address that, which you do to some part. But it also highlights how philanthropy has a unique role in being able to always think about the long term and set the stage for that.
Yeah, I think I'd build on that. I realize looking at the Canadian philanthropic scene And PFC has been quite helpful in supporting a piece of research that was done with foundations across Canada looking at the COVID response. And it looks like so many of us were able to really pivot quite quickly, and that those first couple of months were really quite instrumental in setting up response funds and new resources to really delve into the emergency. And there were many that set aside timelines and restrictions and moved to what many refer to more as trust-based philanthropy, and really trying to listen to what was happening on the ground. And I think that is a kind of a key piece for philanthropy vis-a-vis government, is that so many of us are very connected to the local and are able to understand how communities are dealing and also what they need to respond, and to be able to be very, very respectful and almost kind of flipping the power dynamic to say, what is it that you need from philanthropy at this time? And I'd say a lot of actors in Canada did that. I wouldn't say that's across the board. This is a sector that tends to be somewhat conservative, and there is a contraction, because we don't know what this economy is going to look like. And obviously many institutions' investments crashed at the beginning. So there was a contraction. But let's hope that there's enough peer influencing to say that this is really, if ever there was a time to do things dramatically differently, because of not just the COVID crisis, but the looming climate crisis and what it's going to mean for all of our communities, that we have to do things differently. So I would say overall that we've learned that we are very, very key to community transformation. I think that we have learned that we are too white as a community, and that we have to really focus much more in terms of how we are going to be relevant to Indigenous, Black, people of color communities. And many of those communities are telling us as such. But I'm inspired by the amount of desire by philanthropy to want to take more risks and to want to collaborate more.
Interesting, thanks. I'd like to explore that idea a bit further about the tension between the long-term view and the immediate needs created by the crisis. But right now, perhaps pursue a bit further our role vis-a-vis governments. I mean, Joanna, you touched on that the as a reflection of community voices, that the community is very white. But at the same time, governments have played a key role in most Western countries. I mean, the failure of the federal state in the U.S. is perhaps a unique case of a state failing in its role. But in most countries, including Canada, the governments have played the key part of the response. So, where is space for foundation to make sure that the change is happening, that it is transformative? Is it in, are we like are we a critical part of the puzzle, or should we focus on elements where the state is absent? How do we view our role as foundation in terms of creating meaningful change, like in relationship with governments? So Zia, maybe you want to start us on that piece and looking at the U.S. experience perhaps in particular.
Sure. So a lot of it is it depends, and I won't get into the politics of it, but I've been with Rockefeller during the Obama administration and during the Trump administration, and all I'll say is how we work with government has noticeably changed. There's no replacement for government when it comes to the moral authority that government has through political processes and also through the resources that they have. So even the Rockefeller Foundation, which is, certainly not the biggest foundation in the world, but a sizable foundation. I remind my colleagues that the New York City Department of Education spends more by noon every day than we give out in a year. And so we just have to recognize it's a slippery slope if we think that we can supplement, government or play the role of government in certain areas. That's just not possible. The two roles that I think we can play is around putting a spotlight on something that government should be paying attention to and augmenting government. And I'll give you two quick examples. In the US here, we had a situation where there was just not enough testing happening. So some of my colleagues quickly convened together experts, put together a call to action for a testing plan with a credible action plan underneath it. And just putting forth that plan without trying to really criticize anyone, but highlighting that this is what we need and it is indeed possible, helped mobilize and engage and put some more responsibility on government to start to steer and align their resources. But it also created a little bit of a neutral place for private partners to come into play and coordinate as well. So that's sort of one role that I think philanthropy can play. And there's lots of examples in the US and in Canada of really strong successes. The second area I would say is around augmenting government. And sometimes government can't play a role or can spend money in certain ways that philanthropy can. And when you combine the two, you get something really powerful. So for example, as government has a lot of programs here in the US, benefits programs to help supplement people's income and nutrition and food, et cetera. And as the need dramatically increased, government capacity didn't increase accordingly. So we were able to support a lot of civil society groups that deliberately reach out to people, get them signed up for government assistance and help them receive that assistance. So we're able to fill a particular gap in the system. So I think putting a spotlight on an issue and influencing resources in that direction and augmenting in some ways are two important roles for philanthropy to play with respect to government.
And Joanna, in terms of that, like the Canadian experience at MakeWay and that relationship with government during the crisis, what are the key takeaways that you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly to build on Zia's point, there are again many foundations that are very closely connected to communities and know exactly what they need and can get big chunks of government funding to communities very, very quickly. And so, for example, we were able to disperse funds to northern, remote, and indigenous communities that came via the government very, very quickly, but get them into communities in ways where communities could trust where they were coming from and that they were going to be distributed according to those communities' prioritization and how they saw the various needs within the community. So I think that's just moving money and making sure that it's being appropriately applied as per community needs. But the other thing, I think, just not just in the response, but going forward, if we look at the problems that we are facing, there are many technical problems that I think the government has a really critical role to play to resolve, like getting the vaccine out. But then there's going to be a huge number of adaptive problems, right? And in fact, most of the problems that are kind of root causes of our crises, whether it's the climate crisis, our economic system, the causes of inequality, all of these pieces, these are adaptive problems, and they are going to need philanthropic money and influence to figure out how to better support organizations to manage complexity, to develop emergent solutions, to develop emergent thinking, to get out of the silos so that we actually start connecting all of the issues. Where a Ministry of Health is tackling one thing and a Ministry of Natural Resources is tackling another, philanthropy can actually get beyond that and actually see problems at community, at local level, at a subnational level in ways where they are truly interconnected and try to find interconnected solutions. And so that role that we play to move beyond technical solutions to ones that are much more adaptive, I think it's kind of a fundamental role of philanthropy.
Let's pursue this idea of scale and complexity in the relationship with philanthropy. I mean, I've noticed there's a much greater appetite for collaboration between foundation and with other stakeholders in civil society. Do you have examples of collaborative platforms that really inspire and excite you in terms of making an impact? Like Zia, do you want to start? Or go ahead, Joanna, sorry.
How about Joanna, how about you go ahead?
Yeah, let me just speak to one because it sticks with me so clearly. And it's one, I joined MakeWay in March of 2019. Again, it feels like 20 years ago, right? In COVID years. And I was invited to Peguis First Nation in Northern Manitoba. And there we support a funder collaborative. And it's a funder collaborative that is supporting over 20 First Nations communities. And it's called the Northern Manitoba Food Culture Change Collaborative. But what is so inspiring about it, and I actually shared with you folks the resources of kind of what makes it different, it's that the entire design of the program work is done by community leaders. And funders stand back in a collaboration and respond accordingly. But there you see that the community has said, yes, this is about food security, but it's also about youth empowerment. It's also about tackling climate change. It's also about tackling women's rights. It's also tackling health and just economic well-being for the community. So because it wasn't, funders coming in, oh, what does this community need? No, it was like funders coming together in a collaborative and listening to the communities who said all of our issues are interconnected. Help us change the system so that our food sovereignty, our rights, our well-being, our economic independence is guaranteed. And so I spent the time in community with other funders on this learning trip, which was essentially an unlearning trip. And, it's part of the way that MakeWay works. And, we have an Arctic Funders Collaborative as well. But, when we step back, when we decide to listen, when we decide to collaborate in a way where we're listening from below and shift our power, that I think is when actually real change happens.
Zia, in the UX or global context, any platform that really inspire you, that's similar to the one in Northern Manitoba?
Sure. And I think, Joanna, those were really inspiring stories. The idea of listening, I think, was a habit that also was built during the COVID year, where I think just philanthropies didn't know the answers and had to just ask their grantees what do you need and how to help them. In terms of the collaborations that inspire me, I've been inspired, I guess, by a couple of models. So one is kind of a joint action, joint funding model. So Blue Meridian, which is a collaborative that focuses on economic opportunity here in the United States. And then my colleague, Olivia Leland, who founded Co-Impact, which is a group of funders who come together to focus on opportunities in education, health, and economic opportunity, particularly in the global South. And what I find really compelling about both those models is foundations, at least in the US, do have a habit of, and innovation is in my title, focusing on innovation, focusing on the new thing, thinking about their funding as being that early stage angel funding to take risks and try things. Where there's a bit of a dearth is in proven models that need to scale. Sometimes that cannot feel so exciting. Sometimes people, kind of lose interest after a while, or it's not very sexy. But the benefit of these funding collaboratives is because no one funder's name is attached to it, it frees them from that. And they can kind of take pride in the fact that they're putting their resources together and really writing those $50 million, $75 million checks that are important to take a program that's really proven itself for 10 years to get to the next level of scaling up. So that's one area where I've been inspired, because that's always been a gap. You know, how do you take these really great ideas that are working and scale them up? In the private sector, there are models for that. In the social sector, there aren't. And so we end up with a lot of pilots, a lot of small scale, subscale efforts. The other model that I've been inspired by, which I've also been a part of, is processes that pull together different funders and different folks to work on a specific problem and bring their knowledge and bring their resources to bear. And that is something that we've been partnering with the Brookings Institution with, and I think the ideas originated in Canada around how to drive this process, but it's a process called 17 Rooms, where we get a team together focused around each of the SDGs, but also working with them simultaneously to think about what are the practical, concrete actions that people in the room can help drive to advance and take a next practical step on the SDGs. And it's been a really interesting experience of building community, building connections, collaborating different resources together, surfacing new insights. But it's been a mechanism by which people can collaborate and work together more productively. So I think the type that aggregates capital to help, you know, organizations really scale up, and processes that sort of help people collaborate and work together are interesting mechanisms for philanthropy to think about.
And the strain of the COVID crisis, how have they been felt within these collaborative platforms? Have they helped with the collaboration, or they were forces that make collaboration more difficult?
It's a great question. I'll just offer a quick reflection, because we wrestled with this with the 17 Rooms process, where in March and April, you know, we were wondering, can we really email people about thinking about 2030 when we don't know what's going to happen in 2 or 3 weeks? Like at that point in time, it really felt like the world was imploding. And we felt that there wasn't necessarily a either or a tension, but that we could think about them together. We could think about harnessing the urgency of focusing on COVID, but in a way that created a building, a stepping stone rather, towards the long term. So we used this kind of framing of the near-term response, the midterm recovery, and the longer-term reset. And I think it was the urgency of COVID that put pressure on people to realize we don't have time to dilly-dally. We need to come up with real solutions that provided that forcing function. At least that's what I saw through that process.
And Joanna, if from your perspective, have you felt that tension?
I think that certainly around the work that we do to support Indigenous-led solutions, nature and communities thriving together, it has felt more relevant than ever. In that respect. So there's been more interest for people to understand, this concept of One Health, of human health and the planetary health, that more people are seeking out Indigenous ways of seeing and doing, because this wisdom speaks to how we coexist on the planet. And also very, very aware of how incredibly vulnerable elder communities in Indigenous communities are. If they die, the languages and cultures go with them. And so in many instances, we've seen far more foundation actors and philanthropists wanting to kind of step in and understand how these pieces fit together. But I think overall, to Zia's point about, the sense of urgency, this has been like the greatest wake-up call for all of us. There is no more business as usual. And we, for those who are well versed in understanding inequality and that care work is essential work, that's For us, we've known that for a very long time, but for so many more who now truly, truly understand it. And that this is this moment to actually reprioritize, to think about how we support inequality and crisis, but truly around also that point that Zia says at the beginning. We can't just lose this crisis. This is an opportunity moment. We have to figure out how we use this for a much bigger systems change, for our societies to not just build back better, but bounce forward in exponential ways, because we might never get a moment like this again.
And if I could just pick up, Joanna, on a point that you made, Jean-Marc, if I could just jump in for a second here. I think what you mentioned is so critically important around what we have observed in the crisis, right? Like, who are care workers? Who are essential workers? And in science, there's a whole theory around paradigm shifts, that it's unusual observations that make you go from one whole way of thinking to a new way of thinking. Mm-hmm. And that's what we have to hang on to, right? We have to think about, wow, when we shut down, the world, you could see mountains, in certain cities, and air quality went up, and people, my family's from India, were drinking from the Ganges River, which is incredible to me. Or just how important we all relied on folks, how we were applauding nurses, at 7 o'clock on the balconies. How do we hang on to some of that? Because I think there was a great reveal, and it was a very visceral experience for lots of people.
That point about solidarity and opening our eyes to realities that were always there to be seen. How do we sustain that? I mean, Joanna was mentioning about the fatigue, and the solidarity is more fragile right now that was in March and April. So how do we sustain that for now during COVID, but also for some of the longer term challenges that we're facing around the SDGs, around climate crisis, and what's the role of philanthropy and supporting that solidarity amongst citizens?
Maybe I can start. I mean, I think, again, for this adaptive change, this systems change work, that philanthropy has a real role to play in highlighting, investing in. That looks like more funding to movement building, more funding to community building, more funding to relationship building and unusual suspect relationship building, right? Because we don't know where this is going. This change ahead is none of us can plot it out in a linear path. We need to bring people together and allow them to shift power in the ways that will actually tackle inequality, that will change our economic system, that is benefiting the 1%, right? So this kind of work actually has to be done, but also the work on narratives and culture change, right? The storytelling that we could be supporting, it's not just a green economy that we need to build. It's a circular economy that we have to build. And so what does that look like? What is the narrative around that? It's not just human security that we need to sustain. It's human flourishing that we want to support. It's the centrality of love and care in our societies. Those are narratives that can be born out of this moment where we have seen the most unusual and amazing things. So that's what you hold on to, that these amazing, incredible things that none of us thought possible. So how do you build them? How do you build them? How do you support those narrative projects? How do you support collective power building, community building? And if we just go back to these technical solutions, let's leave that to government. But philanthropy has to be really daring to dream big and to support dream making, at the local level.
You know, I love the point about narratives and culture change. Here in the United States, there's been a narrative since the Reagan Revolution that government is a problem. And we need to seize this moment to highlight to people that, look, it is to our benefit that our community is safe and thriving. You know, it's no good if you're just wearing a mask and isolating yourself. Like, you are dependent on the health and well-being of everyone. And it's government that's going to solve this problem. You know, companies were taking care of their own employees, but it's really government, and there's no escaping that. And government can play a critical role in that. So it really is an opportunity to shift the narrative. And there's something around field building to me that links a little bit of. I agree with you, Joanna, that, you know, the solution isn't only technical projects. But I think we do need some demonstrations, or, you know, some practices that need to change. And it reminds me of when the foundation was really involved in the field of impact investing and trying to build that as a field, which is a combination of new ideas, new narratives, new networks and communities of people, new practitioners, and new practices. Having a few new practices, and that's where, in the US, and I know in Canada, you know, cities are often leaders in this. You know, at the city level, they can really kind of innovate, experiment, replicate, and connect with each other. So I'm optimistic that, you know, at least here in the United States, when the federal story has yet to play out and unfold, but I think what we saw was a lot of pragmatism at the local level. I think what you were describing as well, at the community level. And the more we can foster some of those solutions bottom up, capture them, disseminate them, validate them with new narratives, then I think we can start to see real change. And I think philanthropy has a unique role to play when it comes to movement building, new narratives, new fields, and supporting the voices that can do that.
That's right. And I think the other narrative that can emerge from all of this is that we are all part of nature and hold a stake in its future. And, you know, that's, there's a key role for government, and that we are part of the health of web of life, and we are inseparable from it. And, you know, I look to how many people who haven't necessarily noticed how important nature was to their health and well-being, but also certainly in terms of, you know, the view of the mountains from that your family could see in India, the Ganges, the animals that kind of took over centers of cities during lockdown, all of this. But it's just generally the fact that this virus is part of nature. It's taken humanity down, and never have we been taught a more important lesson from good old Mother Nature, that we are part of her, and we have a responsibility to reciprocate and not just assume that nature is there for our taking.
Can I push you on that? We have the vaccine that are offering, if they seem to be working quite effectively. Distribution, we know that to be effective, we need to target the most vulnerable population across the world. So we may emerge as a society from COVID over the next year, 2 years from now, if all goes well. But do we have the processes to tackle climate change? I mean, if you look at the decline in carbon emission in 2020, they apparently going to be quite marginal, nowhere close to what's needed for 2030 and beyond. Do we have ways of working than the toolkit? And I can make some reference to the SDGs there to address these. It's existential crisis of climate change. It's COVID, a demonstration of that. Our response it's still not up to scale to the challenge that's facing us. So, or am I wrong? Am I being the angel of doom? In fact, that the COVID has demonstrated that when we want to, we can get vaccine out in record time out, and adapt to ways of working of global societies. So where's the balance on that ledger of adaptive capacity versus the scale of the change that are needed to face a crisis?
Who would you like to go first? I'm sure we both want to answer.
Well, Joanna, you go ahead.
So, you know, maybe on a lighter note, I don't know what comedian said, you know, many years ago that we should have never called this thing global warming because it sounds so nice. You know, we should have called this climatia, right? Like a disease, right? And because look how we responded to COVID-19, right? But of course we have the capacity. Of course we have the capacity to respond to the climate crisis in time. Of course we do. But will we? You know, will our collective imagination be ready to kind of step up to the change that each and every one of us is going to have to make, and to have to push our politicians to be able to push corporate power to be different? I mean, this is, so many of our governments are completely influenced by very, very influential corporate players, namely the fossil fuel industry, who are seeing their sunset finally. But you know, we're way behind because of complicity, fear that the public was not ready. But, you know, if you look at, certainly in Canada, poll after poll after poll, Canadians are ready for their governments largely to take much bigger strides and take much more risks to tackle the climate crisis. And now we can talk about it as a climate crisis. So of course, I think we have the power to do it. We have to definitely move it away from an ideological debate, which it became too politicized. You know, that was part of the problem, and that was very cleverly done and influenced by narrative projects, by some foundations around the world who were helping seed all of that. But I feel very, very positive that there are more people out there right now that want to know what to do, and they want our governments, and people working inside companies who want their companies to do the right thing, that as we come out of this, we could do this. Will we do it all in time? Probably not. But I don't think we have a choice, Jean-Marc. I mean, it's there in front of us. We've got the experience in our backpack to do dramatic things quickly, and so let's use that to move forward.
You know, it's a great question. Climate change is probably the biggest and hardest problem that we're facing, and it's probably the most important one as well. And it's challenging because it up until now, it hasn't had, you know, the urgency attached to it. I think that's changing now. I think the forest fires in California made it very real, even though California tends to have a more liberal and progressive attitude towards it. It made it very real in terms of the health risks, the economic costs and such. So I guess I have, you know, two perspectives. I'm encouraged by what I believe are point solutions that are happening. So, you know, at the Rockefeller Foundation, we committed $1 billion to a green recovery and economic development. And a big area of our focus is on rural electrification efforts and how can we do so in a more green energy way. So solar mini grids, for example, or things like that. And that is a helpful offer, certainly, and we're harnessing an economic development agenda, and it's a little bit more of a choice that we think is more reasonable to do it in a green way versus coal-fired plants or such. Similarly, in food and agriculture, I hope that there will be momentum around alternative forms of protein. If all of a sudden India and China start consuming beef at the rate that we do, that's an enormous issue when it comes to forest deforestation and things like that. So I'm optimistic about some of those. At the core of it, though, I don't think we're going to address climate change unless we can hang on to the idea that there's mutual dependency, because otherwise it just will be the tragedy of the commons. And it's just the nature of carbon literally goes and distributes itself all over the world. And there's a lot of important moral questions. One is how unjust it is, and that there are certain populations that are suffering far more from climate extreme events than others. And so they're bearing the cost of it. On the flip side, there's a historical record where the United States and other countries benefited from 100 years of pumping carbon into the atmosphere. And how are we going to encourage the development of economies in Africa or elsewhere without impeding their progress, where they could claim, and make a claim that if we were able to do so cheaply, they should be able to do it as well. So there's a very interesting, how do we see ourselves as mutually dependent, in which case I think COVID, shone a spotlight on how we are. But then how are we going to think of this as an equity issue and an equality issue too? And those are very hard, challenging questions that we need to wrestle down.
And are the SDGs a useful frame to help us move us forward? They are universal, apply to everyone. There's very specific indicators on the 17 objectives. According to the UN and the World Bank, we're going to see significant setbacks in 2020 that COVID related. Mm-hmm. And foundation governments are still struggling to incorporate that into their planning and thinking and monitoring. Is it still a useful frame for helping us getting to that point? Yeah.
So very quickly, I'll offer an opinion. So I think the SDGs are a very useful framework to align the willing. So for those who are committed, it creates a little bit more alignment in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, how we coordinate, how we combine our different resources. And so I think it's very helpful there. What it's not helpful for really is around enforcement. No one's going to SDG court or getting an SDG fine if they don't realize something. And that's just one of the challenges with, kind of a global institutional framework like that. So I think there's still a lot more work that needs to be done on economic policies and really shining a light on the subsidies of the fossil fuel industry, on us realizing that paving roads is a government subsidy. And as a friend of mine likes to talk about, that roads are the ultimate form of socialism, given the negative connotation that socialism has here in the United States. So I think there's a lot of work around what we stop doing. That the SDGs won't be so helpful for, but the SDGs are very helpful when people do want to do something and helping them align and coordinate.
And Joanna, at the community level, how useful are the SDGs to help again to that narrative, new narrative frame that and movement building that you were advocating earlier? Where does the SDGs fit in that?
I mean, as someone who spent most of her career working at the international level, an SDG framework is, as Zia says, a very helpful framework, right? It helps organize the work. It helps prioritize. It also shows the interconnections. It sets up the rooms and the task forces. It starts the conversations. It gets very detailed very, very quickly to help people understand what it is that we need to be moving towards and what are the issues. What are the proposals in order to achieve them? And so then bring along the willing. So it's a very, very helpful roadmap. I would say at a national level, certainly in Canada, I don't think SDGs is necessarily the organizing framework, right? It's not the inspiration. It's something seen out there. I think just generally Canadians don't necessarily have a lot of connection to UN processes. They've probably heard more in the past few years about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, as something as perhaps more relevant and challenging to figure out how we implement here, which is obviously very relevant in the context of SDGs. But I think that Canada's role globally will be relevant in terms of moving forward and implementing the SDGs, and to our moral responsibility, like to take COVID, we're not out of this until everybody is safe, every single person on the planet. And so it's not that we can, tick down to June or September when we'll all be vaccinated, and then phew, we got through that. No, we're in this for a long time until everybody on the planet is safe. And although we've said we're generously going to donate our extra vaccines, it's going to be much more than that in terms of our moral responsibility to tackle global poverty, global inequality, this recession that is being experienced around the world, all of the factors that are creating massive human suffering and biodiversity and climate crisis around the world. That's where we're going to have to step up as Canada once we get through this.
Good. We have a few questions from participants, but before I move to these questions, I have one last question, but for anyone else who wants to ask a question, use the Q&A box to add your question, and we'll go through as many of them as possible within the remaining time that we have. But I'd like to add, my last question to you too is in terms of a foundation that we have an amazing amount of independent of resources from small to large set of resources. What's stopping us from doing our work better? Zia mentioned earlier on that we've learned to remove many of the self-imposed constraints with COVID. Is that sufficient? What more do we need to do to be part of the solutions that you pointed out over the last hour? Zia, you want to get us started on that?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I can certainly think of lots of specific ideas for the Rockefeller Foundation and other philanthropies. In terms of the sector as a whole, I think there's a very interesting question around accountability. And on the one hand, the fact that foundations and philanthropies aren't accountable does give them some freedom to think about the long term, does give them some freedom to innovate, fail where appropriate, et cetera. So there's some benefits to that accountability. On the flip side, I think accountability would help force a rationalization of actions and efforts. And so I think if there was just a little bit more transparency about reporting on results and the impact of the work, or even intentions of behind the funding. We do sort of publish all of our grants that are made, and there's a rationale towards them. But I think it'd probably be hard if you were to read through all the grants of what we are trying to do, what other foundations are really trying to do. So there's some mechanism, I think, to have more transparency and intentionality around publishing that, and then just having the courts of opinion hold different foundations accountable as to whether they're realizing that or not. And if boards could lean into that, I think that would be very helpful.
Joanna?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I, again, it's so many of these foundations operate from such a place of privilege and also kind of a narrow perspectives. So how do we flip the power so that we really are listening and taking our guidance from those who are, on the front lines, are trying to drive systems change and are aware of that this is going to be, a long haul. They are going to need, core funding. They're going to have to be extraordinarily adaptive. And so for us to be able to take off, our hands off the steering wheel and let communities lead and let those from the margins lead, I think, a real shift in the power, flip it upside down, is something that is going to, it's way riskier, but I think, after decades of trying to do it a certain way, but in many respects, maintaining a status quo, where the status quo is only enabling greater inequality, biodiversity, and climate crisis, I think we have to do things very, very differently.
Thanks. Now we'll move now to a few questions that we have received. And for all participants, there's also going to be a pop-up survey at the end of the session today. So you'll see that as you leave the call. I'll take only a few quick questions, and I appreciate your feedback on those. So the first question from Ahmad is that I believe the rapid response era is almost over, and now we need to think about recovery efforts in community. What is needed to move from kind of the emergency to the recovery mode? What's in terms of the philanthropic response? Zia, do you want to take that one?
Sure, and recovery is where it gets complicated. I'm certainly not trying to trivialize COVID at all, but at least there was broad alignment on what needed to happen. We needed to stop the spread of COVID. We need to get everyone vaccinated. And again, those are not trivial questions, but relatively speaking, I think people could get aligned on the outcomes. For recovery, we need a conversation around what outcomes are we really trying to achieve and recover towards. And we're having that conversation here in the United States, even just around, is it $600 that we're providing as immediate assistance or $2,000? And underneath that question is like, what outcomes are we trying to accomplish? Who are we trying to help? How are we trying to help them? So I think, and I'm not sure we can entirely count on our political processes to kind of describe or discuss what is that outcome, because as we've seen, I have a suspicion that most economic recoveries were probably K-shaped, meaning that one branch of wealthy knowledge workers and people who had stock, did well, and one branch didn't do very well. I think that just became very visible right now. So if we kind of keep on the same metrics and same goals, we're just going to see another widening of the inequality gap like we saw after 2008, 2009. So I think the first step, which feels very obvious when I say it, is alignment and goals around what we're trying to really accomplish. And then you can start talking about, do we need to think about minimum wage? Do we need to think about more job security? How can we expand healthcare? But taken individually, all of those are political hot topics. I think we need to have like a vision of what kind of society we want. And we saw that, at least in this country, and I know in Canada in different iterations as well, when we talked about the Great Society and the war on poverty, and there were these big ambitious goals. And there's an economist at the University College London, Mariana Mazzucato, who talks about missions. Can we pick a few missions that have big, ambitious goals and align to those goals, and then leave the means and the strategies as sort of fertile ground for innovation, for new models to get tested out. But I think alignment on the big goals of where we want to go is going to be critically important.
Yeah, thanks, Zia. And Ahmed, to your question, it's, the indicators or the outcomes that we want to achieve, if ever there was a disruptive moment about redefining what well-being is, this has been it. So, our economy should not be measured by GDP, but should be measured by very different well-being indicators. And so, I encourage you to look at wellbeingeconomy.org. It's a global network of thinkers and all sorts of change makers who are really trying to redefine, what a well-being economy would look like for all of us as we recover. And donut economics has been thrown around as a very useful model, but I think if we ignore the economy and how to rebuild it, it's at all of our peril. We can't just reinstate the economy that had to get shut down. It has to be transformed. So recovery has to look at how we rebuild something new that has a very different set of indicators for well-being around human flourishing.
So the next question is a good follow-up on this. And it's in French. So I'll read it in French and I'll read it in English. So, au-delà de la collaboration, il importe de générer une grande alliance entre les fondations. Présentement, il y a beaucoup d'individualisme avec un peu de collaboration. Comment générer une voie commune entre fondations autour des enjeux de la justice sociale et de la justice environnementale? So the question from Jean-Marc Fontan in English is, beyond collaboration, it is important to generate a greater alliance between foundations. Currently, there is a lot of individualism with a little collaboration? How can we generate a common path between foundations around social justice and environmental justice issues?
I can start with that one.
Yeah, start, Joanna.
I can start with that one. You know, I often say, I don't know who said it, you know, change happens at the speed of trust. And so we need to find more ways to build trust together as foundation leaders so that we can actually collaborate at a much, much deeper way. And so how do you build trust? You know, that's the magic that happens through creating safe spaces where relationships can get built, where you can really understand where each other's coming from. You know, it's been very hard to build trust in a Zoom world over these past months. And so those of us who knew each other at the beginning of it could form those relationships and try to figure out new paths forward. But to me, that's almost the essence, that you have to go back to relationship building, trust building, to create that safe space, to build the solutions, to be able to test things, to be able to challenge one another. And I guess PFC is a space for that. You know, Environmental Funders Network is another space where foundations come together across Turtle Island to actually try to find these solutions. And we need to broaden the membership so that there's many diverse voices that are helping us challenge one another in a safe space to take risks together.
Zia, how do we move from collaboration to alliance between foundations?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I have perhaps sometimes an unpopular perspective on it, which is I sometimes worry about the overemphasis in some cases on partnership and collaboration. To me, partnership and collaboration is a means to an end, not an end in itself. And I can think of plenty of times when just sole action, when it comes to a creative or agile need, where having someone act on their own is usually a good thing. In the long term, I do believe we need collaboration and partnership. But I think the missing ingredient is always going to be to what end. And I have found that when the goal is to collaborate or the goal is to partner without an end, then it just becomes this kind of lowest common denominator effort. And it's not super energizing because all the time is spent on the processes and the collaboration and being polite to each other, et cetera. And that's why I come back to the mission idea, where if there actually is a goal, then everyone can understand what is the nature of our partnership, because now we have an end goal that we're trying to realize to it. You know, what can I offer towards that goal? How can I support someone else in that goal? If I think I'm doing something, but someone else can do it better as measured by progress towards that goal, maybe I should support them. So I'm a believer in partnership. I think on its own, it's insufficient. And the necessary ingredient is to what end or what goal are we trying to achieve? And something like trying to achieve social justice just feels a little too broad to me. I don't think that's specific enough. And so I like the idea of, again, you know, things like missions and all that science, you know, or analysis that went behind the mission to put a man on the moon and all the benefits and how people collaborate and achieve something really big. That might be a model for how we make partnership more purposeful.
I agree with you, Zia, but I would just note that in the Canadian philanthropic context, there's not vast amounts of money yet. So it's harder for one entity like a Rockefeller to like step out and do something big and then people take notice and changes happen. I think there is probably the necessity in Canada for more collaboration, for pooled funding to actually achieve something really impactful. But you're absolutely right. Let's be really clear what the goal is, what the point of it is. You know, what is the moonshot, and then come together around that.
And that's the next question. If not the SDGs, what is the best set of standardized goals that the philanthropic sector could measure itself against? Is there an alternative to the SDGs out there?
That's a good question. I don't know if I hesitate to say there's an alternative to the SDGs, because I think it's important that everyone recognize, you know, that the SDGs had such an invested political process and are legitimate. But let me throw something out there. You know, picking up on your point, Joanna, around like how you collaborate, you know, things and folks together, because you know there is a downside to one foundation or one actor moving, because everyone then starts to think, well, that's their thing, you know, and it becomes a little harder to bring people into the tent. So I like to think of these as quilts where everyone needs their patch. The challenge is, how do we define the right size quilt so that everyone can bring their patch, understand how their patches relate, and feel that our patches will fill the quilt. So I'm trying to think about, you know, when it comes to hunger or something like that, I would find it very motivating if there was a group of foundations who are all working on food security or nutrition to think about no child should go hungry. Like that would be an exciting, I think, and meaningful goal. It could get translated into more specific metrics. But if we could really build a coalition of foundations around that, we're trying to do that when it comes to energy. You know, what we're trying to define as energy poverty, people who don't have access to electricity. There's all sorts of health and social and economic deprivations they experience. How can we mobilize a community around that, where we know that obviously we can't address it on our own, we can try and play a catalyst role. But I think if we can start to think about goals or missions around at that level, you want it to be big enough to matter, but small enough to be achievable. That's sort of a way to galvanize, I think.
We have another question around that collaboration. Are there examples of where collaboratives have done that taking to scale? The risk is creating new platforms for discussion and sharing, but still a lack of commitment to long-term investment and processes that will take time to realize transformative change. So are there specific examples of where that philanthropic collaboration is actually given some meaningful impact?
Joanna, why don't you go ahead?
I mean, I'm just thinking globally. I mean, think about HIV and AIDS. I mean, that was a massive, massive collaboration by governments, by philanthropy that, you know, got very, very far to bring the HIV crisis within, you know, within control. I think, you know, there's certainly around climate, right before the crisis, the COVID crisis hit, you could see much greater collaboration happening in Canada, but globally, just around all the different parts of a system, because this is the most wicked problem ever. All the different parts of the system that needed to be tackled in terms of policy change, in terms of behavior change, in terms of movement building, in terms of creating alternatives, et cetera. So, I mean, I think take any big, hairy issue, I think there has been a lot of collaboration that has happened, and you could pull out the lessons. But it's again, to Zia's point, get very, very clear on the goal, and let's all figure out our role to play in the system and what we can do to push, and one can make great things happen.
Yeah, I you know, it's hard for philanthropy to scale. It just doesn't have the resources to do so. But it can help fill in gaps, and it can help play some of those early stages. So to the degree, just to create a very tangible example, when it comes to investments, you know, to the degree that philanthropy can put in capital that is first loss capital or a guarantee for returns. And then if there could be another layer of development finance institutions which need to earn returns but can earn lower returns, and that there's a way to put on a layer of private capital, then I think those kinds of combinations and blended structures in finance are an interesting metaphor to think about how we can do broader sort of scale and build scale in upfront. To me, there's nothing, you know, sadder, frankly, than, you know, the hope and vision of social entrepreneurs who just run into a wall, you know, because they weren't thinking about scale. And social entrepreneurship doesn't work like regular entrepreneurship, and that there aren't capital markets or large corporations that are going to, you know, acquire and take to scale. And so there has to be some thinking about how do we blend up front And I'm a big fan of social entrepreneurs. I have huge respect for them. But in some ways, I think we might have overemphasized this kind of standalone entrepreneurial model for social change and done some really smart, well-intended folks a disservice by not thinking with them about what is the bridge to scale.
Okay, I'm going to take one last question, and I'll invite both Zia and Joanna to put any concluding comments within that answer that question. So, as philanthropic leaders both in the US and Canada, what would you advise young philanthropists on tackling such intersectional issues? So, again, that long-term view. Someone's coming into the sector, wants to make a difference. What's your key advice in terms of how do we move from here? Joanna?
I mean, start with a lot of listening, be humble, just be humble and start with a lot of listening. And, unfortunately, so much of our work, either as philanthropy or as governments, is actually trying to fix the problems that were created by a broken economic system. Right? Like it's just the band-aids that we're doing. So we actually need to figure out how to tackle the system, the root causes of the big challenges that face us today. So that would be the other thing is to figure out how to work with others around systems thinking, systems change, and not just pick off your pet projects that might make you feel good. But that's a much longer, longer time horizon, and you have to think much more adaptively. But listen, stay humble.
I couldn't agree more with that. I think being conscious and aware of the power that gets conferred upon you. And I think that's a little harder for people earlier in their career than perhaps later in their career. If you've been on the side where you're trying to pitch or sell, you understand the dynamic. And so you're a little bit more aware of how to maybe handle it on the other side. So that would be one aspect. And then the second aspect is, I don't know if this relates to what you're describing, Joanna, but I think it's having the courage to take perhaps an imperfect step forward in service of the broader system and making some change happen. I think there can be a fear or an analysis paralysis around these are such precious dollars. I need to make, I spend them, very, very cautiously. But just to recognize that there's opportunity cost to waiting, there's time, people are suffering, and to just have the courage to be able to say, I think this is good enough. Let's try it and see what happens. Which will lead to some failures along the way. And it's sometimes easy to say, let's celebrate failure, et cetera. Failure never feels good. And particularly when you're earlier in your career and you don't have the track record that you want
to have. Both Joanna and Zia, I'd like to say a big thank you. You've lifted some dark clouds and can inspire at least me in terms of the transformative power of philanthropy and how we can work differently. So a couple of points before we close is that there's going to be a short survey popping up as you go out, and please to fill it. And to plug in the next webinar that we are doing jointly with the Community Foundations of Canada on January 13, 1 o'clock. And the topic is exploring trust-based philanthropy. So Joanna mentioned that earlier on. It's been, we've seen a significant movement in that space, but people are still wondering what does trust-based philanthropy look like, and how do we support and sustain it? And what do you do when something goes wrong? So that's some big question. But again, you really inspired us to start the year. Yes, dealing with the crisis now, but keeping our eye on the ball for what needs to be done to build the world we all want to live in. So Joanna and Zia, thanks a lot for your time. Thanks everyone for participating today. And we'll see you.
Thank you for having us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Joanna. That was a wonderful discussion.
Yeah.